Alright, and welcome back to another web development video where I show you how to make modern websites using HTML5, CSS3, and a little bit of JavaScript. In this video we're going to look at something brand new. It's only really in one browser, so you're going to have to use Firefox to be able to see it, but it's the topic of a subgrid in CSS Grid. We've always been able to nest grids, so you can sort of nest one grid inside of another, but that grid had its own unique properties, and it couldn't take on the properties of the super parent, the grandparent grid, or the parent grid in our case here. And so we want those subgrid items to be able to move like our children of the regular grid, our top level grid. I'm still trying to figure out specific instances where this might come into play, and Rachel Andrew has some thoughts on it on her website, Grid by Example. There are others who have come up with some card-based type layout problems where subgrid could help. But today I'm just going to sort of focus on teaching what is it, how do you manipulate it, what does it look like when you do manipulate it, and it's kind of going to be up to you to figure out how to use the tool, because I can't necessarily think of something right offhand that's just a really common problem. But if you should find yourself saying, man, I wish that this subgrid could take on the properties, the row and column properties, and even the gap properties of the parent grid, that would be really awesome. So this is coming. It's being implemented in browsers now, and again, as of Firefox 71, which I think they're about 77 right now, 71, 74, or something like that, it's been implemented in Firefox. So you can actually see this. So that's what we're going to do. And we're here in Codepen, and we have a grid set up here, just sort of an outer grid. There are 12 grid items, and then one of those items is actually called subgrid, and that subgrid has 12 more sub items inside of the grid. So let's just set this up. And the grid is going to be display grid, and we'll say grid template columns, repeat 4, and 1FR. We'll just make it a, so there are 12 grid items, so it's going to be a 4x3 grid. And grid template rows, we'll just go ahead and make a sort of a rigid grid here. Repeat 3, 1FR, and we'll give it a gap of, let's say, 10 pixels. Okay, so this is not going to show anything because our grid items, there's no way to distinguish between them. So let's just give our grid items a color. Since our grid actually has some explicit, I guess it has some explicit values, it should show up. So let's just say background of some light gray color, and let's make this an explicit value. So let's say 200 pixels. So if you give a real value, it would help with these things. Let's make sure we got everything right. Oh. So, sorry. Okay. It's grid item. That's the problem there. And let's go ahead and give these an explicit value of 100 pixels, or it could be 200, you know, whatever, so that they have an expressed height. Because these don't have anything inside of them, if I had content inside of them, you wouldn't have to worry about it, because the content would make the cell have some height. But an empty container is not going to have any height to it. So we're just adding a little bit of height, 200 pixels to each of the rows. So now you can see we have our 12 items, so it's a 4 by 3. And this item here is 1, 2, 3, number 4, which is 1, 2, 3, number 4 is our subgrid. Okay, so it's not taking on this background color because it's not actually a grid item. So you could just as easily add that class of grid item like that, and then it would fill in our box over here. So I just left that out because it's not particularly relevant to what we're doing, but it might be something that you would need to add. So when we come down, what we want to do is we want to make this subgrid into a grid as well. So obviously we can come down and just say subgrid, display grid, and we'll say grid template columns. We have 12 items there, so we'll do the same. We'll do something very similar to this. Let's just copy and paste that. So we'll repeat 3, and then this one will repeat 4. And then we need to come down to our subgrid item, and we'll say this is a background of a little bit darker color. So you can see here that our subgrid is in this cell, but it's bursting out of everything that we have. So we run into some issues here. So let's say gap is 20 pixels. And we'll have a little bit of a gap between those. So you can see that our subgrid is sort of breaking out or bursting out of everything. We could manipulate our subgrid since it's on this grid right here. We could manipulate our subgrid and we could say grid column 1, 2, 4, something like that, and it would actually move our grid. It would move our grid so that it starts at grid column 1 and goes to grid column 4, and you can see that all of our grid is here. It's not matching up with everything necessarily. If we did this as 2, you can really see that it really has its own set of lines, right? So this grid inside here is not at all matching these grid lines here, which are nice and even and put together and straight, because these are all adhering to this grid, and then these darker squares are adhering to a whole separate grid inside of this one cell, which stretches from line number 1 all the way to line number 4. So you can manipulate that so that it goes as far as you need it to go. And that could be line number 1 to 3, which takes the first 2 columns here. And so you can see that it kind of matches up because we're running into a situation where they get kind of close with the 2. But as soon as you go out to the 4, this has 3 in the same space that this has 2 as far as columns. So you're running into some weird issues, and what we want is for this subgrid to take on, so that when we say grid column 1 to 4, it should take on the same structure as this outer grid. Okay, so that's a lot of setup for what we're going to do. And so let's first do it for the columns, because I think it'll be maybe easier to see. And all we do is on our subgrid, which is one of our grid items, but it's the one that we want to have the subgrid. We take the grid template columns, and instead of having 2 columns and 1 FR, we can say subgrid. And then it takes on, what happens is this takes on and mirrors this. So the subgrid of the parent grid takes on the grid template columns and grid template rows from the parent grid. So here we're expressing our own rows, so we can actually change and manipulate those rows because we're not using. Well, it's actually the same as up there. Let's say 8. So it's just not. I'm trying to find enough variations here that you can see. So now you can see that our rows are not matching up. So I'm just trying to help understand this. So our columns are all matching up. If we're getting some weirdness here because our grid gap is not the same, but if it were the same, you would be able to see that our columns are in fact matching up, but now our rows are not matching the parent grid. So we can have one way, or we can have two-way subgrid. So you can come up and you can say, we can put subgrid on the template rows, and we're going to have to express this maybe in grid row 1 to 4 or something like that. And so now you can see that it's taking those things on as well. We're losing quite a few things here from our grid section out here. 100 pixels that way. Okay. So I think what's happening is we're covering up some of the issues here. So let's say it's going to be repeat 4, 1FR. So it's going to be an express value to give them some shape. Okay, so now we see we're bursting out again of our rows. We're still accessing the 4 columns across. They're 100 pixels each, so you can change that and you can see that changes. So now they're all 300 pixels or 200 pixels, and even our subgrid is taking our column structure, but it's not taking our row structure. If we were to remove that completely and we didn't have any sort of expressed columns, then our template rows, I think everything would just sort of snap and align to that if we needed to. You can see here that things are snapped to it, but it's not the right line, right? If this took on the same structure as this grid, then this is line row 2, right? Row 2 would be right here, not in the middle, in between. So still, when we remove this, it doesn't actually take this on per se. It creates its own structure. So it's got 4 columns across at 200 pixels, and then there's 3, 6, 9, 12 of these. So it's just sort of intrinsically laying out the grid. And it's not laying it out to its own sort of default grid rows. It's auto rows. But it's not laying it out according to this super grid, this outside grid. We would need to call that subgrid in order to make that layout the same way. Okay, and then now we're going to need our columns to be more like, or our rows to be 3, 6, 9, 12. Do that. And we need our rows to be, let's just make the numbers large, okay, so we can see all of the items on the grid. And then, okay, so now we can see all of our items on the grid. We have this 12 column subgrid inside of this other grid here. Now if we go ahead and we label each of these, subgrid we'll just know because it's darker. But you'll see how these things are being laid out. So you can see that our subgrid, even though it's the fourth item in our grid, it's been moved to start at column 1 and go to column 4, and then row 1 to row 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? So that's what we expressed here. So it starts at column 1 and goes to column 4, and then here it's 1 to 5. So if we were to manipulate this, it would change everything, so that you can see it would take up all this space, and then that pushes all of the non-expressed items, so the grid items, it pushes it down, and then you would need to just sort of manipulate that. It doesn't need to go down as many rows because it pulls everything. We need to pull everything back up. So this is actually a subgrid. It's an item of a grid, but it's actually behaving in the form of the entire grid. So that when we say start at grid column 2 and go to grid column 4, then it's actually starting in this overall grid at grid column 2, and it's taking up that space. And then it pushes everything else here, so this is 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then 7, 8, 9, 10, which lay out like you would expect on the grid. So it's akin to the idea of displacement in physics or with water. So when you put a rock, you put a dense object into water, it actually displaces the water. It pushes the water out to the sides. And so now there's water on the sides and around the object that you just put into the water. So this creates sort of a heavy object that will push everything out to the side. Now this would be the same if we took this and did not have the subgrid. If we didn't have subgrid, it would be the same thing, right? So if we just say repeat 4, and we do 50 pixels, and then this one we repeat 3, 50 pixels. Let's see what that does. Okay, so this has the same effect because we're adding these things here, so that if this was 3 to 4, that it would just put it in there. So you can see that this here is creating the heavy object sort of idea. We're expressing this subgrid item specifically to go from this column to this column, from this row to this row. So it's going to actually take up that space inside the grid, and it's going to push everything off to the side, and everything else is going to sort of flow all around it. So that's not necessarily a part of subgrid. We can do that with just normal grids like this, so that if we had 3, it would sort of fit in that space. You can see how it just kind of fits its way into that space. But it's not taking on the column and the row properties of the outer grid. This is its own little special universe in here because we've given it its own special properties. But as soon as it takes on one of the subgrids, or it takes on one of these top level grids, now you can see we still have our 3 across, but it's lining up to all of the outer grid properties. Hopefully that makes sense. It's a bit confusing, and if anyone has a definite example, I would love to see it, because I can't think of any examples right off the top of my head where I thought I really need the ability for this internal grid to be able to connect to this, to be on the same sort of column and row structure as this outer grid. Typically my grids are contained, so I have a grid, you know, it's typically a grid without all this, right? This is typically how I'm going to write grids. They're going to look something like this. I don't have a lot of the complex grid inside a grid sort of structures, and typically if I need another one, then I'll just create a second grid, and then you'll have two grids, so like that, or they'll be stacked in different sections. So a lot of the work that I've been doing with CSS Grid is sort of top level and not particularly complex. But CSS Grid Subgrid allows you to add a level of complexity where you can manipulate elements that are grid children as if, actually grid grandchildren, as if they were grid children. So it's a leap forward. I trust people whenever they say that this is one of the necessary steps. It was actually in the original plan for CSS Grid. It wasn't worked out fast enough whenever they shipped Grid, and so they wanted to make sure they get it right. And it's starting to roll out now, and you can see it. You can see it at play. Like I said, if you have the latest version of Firefox, you should be able to see it. When we show it here, we can actually see the subgrid in action. I'm in Firefox, you can see. And what happens if you open this in what is this, Chrome? You can see that grid structure is behaving inside of there as a nested grid, but it's not taking on the subgrid properties, right? So basically it's just not reading the subgrid. So you would either need to mimic what you need to do with your nested grid, or find out some other solution at this point, because it's not supported in Chrome. So that is subgrid. I hope that's clear. Probably isn't very clear, because honestly to me it's not a very clear topic, but I just wanted to sort of get it out there and get the conversation moving on how to just do the process of working with subgrid. And then I'll leave this example up, and you can play around with it a little bit, and you can just manipulate some of these values. And honestly, it's a lot of working with it. I went to the Mozilla Developer Network page that's about subgrids, and essentially, copied and pasted and filled this out a little bit more. There's more items, but this is essentially the structure that they have and some of the things that they were doing with it. So if you have any questions, you can leave them in the comment section below. I'll do my best to either answer them or direct you to the resources that I know for subgrid. There's not a lot out there. This is brand new. Like I said, it's only in one browser at this point. So expect over the next 6 months to a year for this to be hitting and landing in browsers. I'm sure if you're paying attention on social media or wherever, that people will announce it with glee, because subgrid is solving some complex problems for a lot of people. So if you're one of those people, then you're able to actually do that inside of Firefox. And the last thing that I would cover is you can write what are called feature queries. So just like you would write at media in order to do media queries, you can do at supports, and that would be I don't know if this one here at supports this, So if I want to put my subgrid here, now I can say at supports subgrid, grid template rows subgrid, then run this code. Now what's going to happen is that subgrid code's not going to be run anyway, but this is one way to ensure that subgrid is run, and you can see here that it's still going to be run inside of here because I'm on a browser. Oh, I lost my internet. Let's see if we can get that back. But I've lost my internet too. So let's save that. Okay, and now you can see that because we're on a browser that actually shows that subgrid, then it's going to show it. But if the browser did not support grid template rows subgrid, then it would sort of skip over this. So you want to write this afterwards, and then if you had something else that you wanted to do for subgrid, let's say we wanted this to be repeat 3 100 pixels. Well, let's make that 500. Let's make it extreme. So you can see that we've actually, on our subgrid, we've actually created a grid here. But because this browser does support grid template rows subgrid, it's actually going to run that code. And if it didn't support it, then it would be here, which we'd be able to see on Chrome. Let's just make sure everything works. We're going to take that same exact link. This is the code that we just saved. We're going to open it in Chrome. Hopefully it works. Okay, and now you can see that it's taking our styling, right, of 500 pixels tall. Each row is 500 pixels tall, which is very different than it fitting into the grid structure here. And this is happening because this is not being done here because Firefox supports grid template rows subgrid. So whatever the property is, if you put it here in an at supports query and you put that at supports last, so whatever you want the fallback to be, you put first, and then whatever you want the sort of progressive enhancement to be, you put at the end. It will run this code, and then when Firefox gets to this code, it reruns this one. Whenever Chrome gets to this code, it runs it, and then when it sees this and says, I don't support that, it just passes over that code. So that's one way that you can begin to implement subgrid now. So Firefox users are going to they're going to see one thing, and Chrome users or whoever are going to be able to see something different. So that's one way to progressively enhance your website. And then the reality is that once Chrome gets this ability to do subgrids, it's going to behave just like Firefox. So you don't necessarily have to go back and remove your code unless you need to for size purposes or something at work. But Chrome is going to behave just like Firefox. It's going to do the first one, and then when it sees at supports and it says, well, I support that now, so I'm going to run this code, and then it's actually going to run that code. So this is similar to what we were doing with the original CSS Grid spec whenever it came out. And as browsers accepted it, then they would run the CSS Grid code, and if you wanted to put in a flexbox type fallback before that, it would give you a flexbox grid if it didn't support the CSS Grid code. So that was one way to sort of get around it, and that's called a feature query, and we use the at supports. Alright, hopefully that is clear. If you have any questions or comments, leave them in the comments section below. And if you haven't subscribed to my channel, I've got a new series called the web design process, where I'm actually taking you through the very beginning. So you got a client with a project, and where do you go from there? So this is sort of intermediate web development when you begin to work with clients as a freelancer, or doing work through the process of design or development at your job. And it's going well. I'm in part number 2. I just released that yesterday, so there's a couple of long videos in it. There's a lot of information, not related necessarily to code, not related necessarily to colors and layouts, but there are a lot of things to figure out with a website. It's a complex process, so there are a lot of things to figure out before you start even putting pen to paper, thinking about sketches or ideas. So I encourage you to watch that if you're sort of in that space where you're ready to move. If you feel confident that you can make a website, and now you're ready to move into doing that for other people, or even for yourself to create projects, or to test whether you can actually make a website all the way through. So just strategy, thinking, that type of thing. Also, if you haven't subscribed, click subscribe and click the bell, and then you'll get notifications when I upload new videos like this one. And one of the best ways for you to pay it forward is to just click the like button. It's super easy, doesn't require much of you, and that actually helps my videos to be able to travel a little farther, a little wider, and Google begins to trust my content a little bit more, because people are getting some value out of it. So if you're getting value out of this, share it, like it, do something with it, and that really helps me. I appreciate it. Alright, well, that is it for today. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time.